I feel like I should name drop again here just to start, since there's, a tradition of me doing that apparently in the Q&A. Before the break, we spoke briefly about the characteristics of hard-boiled literature, the most common source material for film noir, and how film noir embodies the philosophical stance of hard-boiled, even when the films are not actually adapting hard-boiled tales. Indeed, one could argue that German Expressionism and French poetic realism, usually seen as the filmic precursors to film noir, became noir not just by migrating, but by embracing the particularly American form of mid-century existentialism expressed in hard-boiled writing. And I'll make it easier from here on out if that was a mouthful. So before we begin, I'd like to offer up a few thoughts on the relationship of Mildred Pierce, the film, to the source novel by the same title. First, let me give you a more concrete sense of what hard-boiled writing is, for those of you who were not here for the Q&A, by noting who are its most famous practitioners. The best known were Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, Jim Thompson, and Cornell Woolrich. And actually, as a side note, any guesses as to which of those has had their work adapted the most often to film? Woolrich. Thank you. Woolrich. Most people say Chandler or Kane, and far and away it's Woolrich. 31 films have been made from Woolrich stories and novels. To these, you could add Carol John Daly, the so-called originator of the style. Many credit his 1923 story, Knights of the Open Palm, as the first truly hard-boiled tale. Dorothy B. Hughes, Patricia Highsmith, David Goodis, Horace McCoy, Chester Himes, and more recent authors in the mid-century tradition, such as, I'm going to skip someone on the list, Christa Faust, Reed Farrell Coleman, Ken Bruin, etc. In the case of Mildred Pierce, the source novel comes from the man who is arguably the most talented writer of that incredibly talented bunch, James M. Cain, also the author of The Postman Always Rings Twice, the one novel you must read if you want to understand what hard-boiled writing is. Mildred Pierce was the least hard-boiled of his early novels, more of a domestic melodrama than a tale of corruption or violence, so typical of hard-boiled. It is the story of a snobbish, bitter, and largely unimaginative housewife whose divorce at the height of the Great Depression forces her to become a resourceful businesswoman to provide for her daughters, or really for her favorite daughter. It is a sprawling and operatic work in every sense, full of complicated and tragic love affairs, fortunes made and lost, family relations strained to the breaking by reversals of fortune and betrayals. And yet, it ends in a fashion that is so mundane as to be dramatic. Mildred loses everything and decides she wasn't so bad off where she started. The film is both more and less hard-boiled than the novel. It is consistently less hard-boiled in its portrayal of characters. For, like so many film adaptations, it cleans up certain ambiguities in order to get us to associate with some characters and to react viscerally against others. But as if to compensate, it culminates in murder rather than in resignation, like the book. The novel is third person and chronological. The film is a first-person account narrated from Mildred's point of view in flashback. As much as the decision to turn this into a tale of murder, it is this decision to make this story a first-person thriller investigating the murder that turns it into a film noir. Or rather, it is this decision that turns it into a partial film noir. As you watch, pay special attention to the fact that only certain moments in this film look and feel noir, to wit, the moments in the present tense investigation of the murder and those moments in the flashback story that were key events leading up to the murder. These are told with the trademark hard-boiled dialogue and the typical noir style of low-key, high-contrast lighting, fog-shrouded exteriors, shadow-drenched interiors, and ambient noises that are exaggerated to the point of personification, another hallmark of the noir style that is too rarely discussed. However, a good deal of the movie is more of a melodrama than of an earlier era, a bit more gritty in the details of its story perhaps, but dramatically cleaned up from the novel. This is a film caught in between in some ways. Darker than the novel in its denouement, though not as bitter. But because of the times, that is the height of the production code, and also, I would argue, because of the top-shelf talent assigned to the project, it is less gritty than the novel. To have made this like the novel would have required a director such as Siadmak or Wilder or Dmytryk, rather than the great Michael Curtiz of Casablanca fame. And to Casablanca add just about everything else you think of with Hollywood. I mean, the Adventures of Robin Hood, Yankee Doodle Dandy and Casablanca in the same year. It's just amazing if you look at his filmography. And it might have required a lead actress like Claire Trevor or Jane Greer, or Crawford herself, but Crawford unleashed by a more daring director, more willing to roll her in the mud. The Crawford of her follow-up films like Possessed and The Damned Don't Cry. I don't want to give the impression that this is not a tremendous film, for it is. Above all, it is a film of great performances and occasionally brilliant cinematography. The great performances obviously start with Crawford, who, although she was given a somewhat cleaned up role and character from the novel, played it brilliantly with tremendous nuance that's very subtle throughout the film. And in fact, James M. Cain thanked her personally and sent her an inscribed limited edition leather-bound copy of the book as a thank you for her portrayal. But I think it could have been a greater work if the characters had been allowed a greater degree of moral ambiguity. And here, I would argue that maybe the great performance of the film is actually Jack Carson's performance as Wally. He is the very type of gray that is the heart of film noir, always waffling, always morally ambiguous. It's also a film of very clever adaptation. As I mentioned, it jettisoned a large portion of the book, and it found a really simple and elegant workaround, which was to create this murder frame around the narrative that allowed the director to excise whole parts of the plot but still make a tight narrative. With that, I would say it ranks right up there with a film like L.A. Confidential and the famous Rollo Tomasi twist as one of the best truncations of a novel ever. With that in mind, I'd like to kick off tonight's screening with a little experiment, one that's intended to demonstrate that that despite some of the limitations vis-a-vis the source material, this 1945 film did manage to create fairly nuanced and complicated characters, more so than many films of the time, as evidenced by the original trailer for the film, which tries to flatten the male leads and Mildred herself into simple character types for mass consumption, and also to demonstrate that there is another, more complicated story lurking in the source material waiting to be told, and lucky for us, perhaps it will be told in another powerful fashion with the 2011 miniseries that is about to be released by HBO. Thanks very much.